So, today we're going to touch down into the world of Mary Blair. We are now up to part 5. Mary Blair is often seen as Walt's favorite artist, a watercolorist who changed how Walt visually thought of animation and later attractions at his theme park. In earlier episodes, we've looked at Mary's childhood and early years, as well as that of her husband, Lee. Mary came from a poor but supportive family, while Lee came from an upper middle class background whose parents at times suggested that he focus on how he might be a success, like earlier Blair family members who had jobs of national significance. Both Mary and Lee went to the Chouinard Art School, where they became involved with the California scene movement, overseen by their instructor, watercolorist Millard Sheets. Their watercolors from this period brought them both early recognition, particularly for Lee. But after graduation, both Lee and Mary, after getting married, found work during the Great Depression at various animation studios in Southern California. As we last left off, Lee had recently moved from the Harmonizing Studio over to Disney to work in their story department and as a color stylist, and Mary was working as a color stylist and concept painter for the animation division now at MGM. Though Lee was uninterested in working on Bambi, a film that, as he saw it, was about cute talking animals, Walt convinced him to stay and instead work on a more challenging project, a feature that would later be known as Fantasia. And with that, I believe we are now ready to jump into part 5. Here we go. Now that Lee Blair had agreed to stay on at Disney's, he moved his desk from the rented Seward Street studio space back to the main lot at Hyperion Avenue. Though Walt was building a new state-of-the-art complex in Burbank, a studio that would include a 3-story animation building as well as a full-service commissary and open green space, the Hyperion lot remained the center of operation for both Pinocchio and Fantasia for nearly all of 1939. At the center of the Hyperion complex were the dedicated studio buildings, including a 2-story structure for animators and directors as well as a soundstage. But around it was a hodgepodge of apartment buildings and boarding houses that Disney had converted into workspace, largely for story, layout, and background artists. As Lee was attached to the story department to develop a narrative for a sequence in Fantasia, he found space in one of the buildings next to the studio proper. "I was working in the apartment houses there on Hyperion," he explained. "I did the storyboard on Dance of the Hours." The mischievous animal characters in the Dance of the Hours sequence were largely inspired by one of Preston Blair's favorite artists, German-born Heinrich Klei, whose work had been introduced to an American audience through a series of sketches he had recently published in Coronet magazine. Klei's illustrations included dancing elephants, hippos, and alligators, whose anthropomorphic designs would form the basis of the surreal animal ballet, though of course Disney would adapt their designs to better fit the whimsical mood of the film. Though Lee worked at times with Preston, he more often worked with story artist Earl Hurd and concept artist James Bordero. The three of them together were largely responsible for developing a visual story featuring dancing animals like those by Klei that would pair perfectly with the music. As Dance of the Hours had originally been created as a 19th century ballet, Walt believed that animal characters in his film should also perform ballet steps. What they did, Lee explained, was they sent us down to the Ballet Russe de Monte Carlo, who in January performed with the Los Angeles Philharmonic at the Philharmonic Auditorium. Another Disney artist, John Hench, explained that Walt set up backstage passes for artists to view the ballet performance and to talk with the director and dancers. Though Ballet Russe did not perform Dance of the Hours, the performance provided demonstrations of the basic moves and rhythms of ballet, largely for Disney artists who were at best only distantly acquainted with the art form. We absorbed it all, Lee explained. Beyond Clyde's drawing and the Ballet Russe performance, the sequence would have one more notable influence. A musical number from a film released the previous year, an omnibus presentation called The Goldwyn Follies. Towards the end of that film, it featured an elaborate dance sequence called the Water Nymph Ballet, in which a ballerina rose up out of a circular pool of water and then performed with other dancers before twin rows of Roman columns. This musical number would not only give rise to key features of Disney's Dance of the Hours, such as a ballerina hippo rising up out of a circular pool, but would also suggest the setting, which included outdoor Roman columns, short flights of white steps, and of course the circular pool hemmed in by a raised stone or cement lip. In this, the Disney version, with its dancing hippos and alligators, became a near-comic parody of this serious ballet presentation in the Goldwyn film. As Lee developed story beats, he remained conscious of the sequence's connection to earlier films, not just the Goldwyn Follies, but also previous musical spectaculars. I wanted to make it look like a great extravagant ballet, Lee said, Busby Berkeley or whatever. With Bordero and Hurd, Lee worked out the rough overview of the dance, which presented love-crazed alligators chasing after hippos in tutus, often to comic effect. As the sequence was being planned out for storyboards, Disney hired professional dancers to further develop the choreography. Lee explained to one group of dancers, "Now, these are the ostriches." Then he asked them to imagine their bodies having wings, but also the weight limitations of a large flightless bird. He asked another group to arrange their moves as though they were tall, slender alligators who walked upright on their short legs, enabling quick spins, but prohibiting long leaps. And so some dancers would try to dance like ostriches, Lee continued, and they would do these formations that eventually ended up in the film, with ostrich feathers and the fans and all that. The performance was filmed on the Disney soundstage, footage that would not only guide later animators, but also Lee and members of the story department. Once finished, Lee and others studied the film, frame by frame on a moviola, to isolate and understand each dance move, pose by pose, turn by turn. Then we used that live action to draw the storyboards, Lee said. Beyond story planning, Lee also created watercolor paintings of key scenes to define the color palette for the sequence, which included a range of dark greens and browns, as well as black and a semi-dark purple, roughly the shade of a violet blossom. When Lee finished with The Dance of the Hours, he developed images inspired by Greek mythology intended for a piece by Maurice Ravel, Daphnis and Chloe, a symphony that alluded to the troubled love story of two teenagers in ancient Greece. But after Walt learned that it would be extremely expensive to use the symphony, as it was under copyright, the studio looked for an alternative musical composition that could be paired with Greek mythology, eventually and somewhat oddly settling on the Pastoral Symphony, a piece by Beethoven that largely spoke to the joys of being in the country, specifically the Vienna woods. They found out it cost too much for Ravel, explained Lee, and they didn't really have the rights to use the music. They took this Grecian thing and then plonked it right into Beethoven. In this, the Pastoral Symphony had one of the strangest origin stories for any sequence in Fantasia. The Disney sequence, whose images were originally keyed to a story set in ancient Greece, were adapted to match the music of Beethoven, specifically a piece in which he reflected on the pleasures found in the German countryside in the early 1800s. In terms of its topical unity, Lee explained, it's kind of a bastardization, really. But Lee also knew the work he was doing was now far more sophisticated and artful than any type of animation project on which he had previously worked. Like other studio artists, he understood that Walt was exploring how animation might move, if only in small ways, into the world of high art, creating a film more refined than typical Hollywood entertainment, a work that gave viewers both the experience of visiting a concert hall and also an art museum. In this, Lee became proud of his efforts, often pointing out how deeply he had contributed to the film. In terms of the Pastoral Symphony, he said, I drew up the whole sequence with some pastels. It's practically mine. During these same years, the Blairs' lives changed in other ways. Mary remained at MGM, where she oversaw color development for the studio's cartoons, including the version of Goldilocks and the Three Bears that Hugh Harman had originally developed for a Disney release, that is, before RKO insisted Disney stop outsourcing animation to them. Just as Lee had done, she created watercolors to demonstrate how a film might use color to create harmonies and also amplify its emotional tones. The job at MGM was not perfect. More than once she complained that men there made advances, which she repeatedly rebuffed. But the job gave her things she needed beyond work and a salary. It gave her a community, which was something she had been missing since her days at iWorks and in art school. The creation of community is a clear thread that is woven through her time at MGM. Toward the end of July 1939, Mary organized a Saturday party for the 50 members of the MGM animation team. The outing will take the group for a combination hayride and barbecue on one of the spacious ranches near Los Angeles, with the ride expected to start from the North Hollywood stables at 8 p.m. The party also had a theme. Those attending should dress as either a farmer or a country bumpkin, a theme specifically tied to the hayride. Among various animators and artists, director Hugh Harman and Rudy Eising were there. But more importantly, the party demonstrated to Mary that studio life could provide a home, complete with friends and colleagues, even as she and Lee struggled to start a family. The desire to have a family also seems woven into their decision to move into a bigger house during these same months, one designed specifically for them. By the middle of 1939, the Blairs were living in a new home in Hollywood Hills, about 4 miles from the Disney studio. It was a tall, narrow house they had helped design. Nestled next to a hill, the house had a garage at the bottom, which led to a long outdoor path with stairs that eventually curved up to a 3-story house on the hill, almost surely too large for any 2 people. On the first floor was a dining room and the living room, with art on the wall that both Mary and Lee had created. On the second floor, the bedroom areas and a bath, and the third was a large open studio with windows and an outdoor deck that opened to Oak Trees Fields and a few houses around them. The house was featured in a magazine focused on contemporary living. About Mary's studio, the reporter wrote, "Only the birds can bother anyone working here. The top level of the house is well away from any household problems of the living floors below. Glass doors to the adjoining deck give the extra room north light, but the deck itself among the treetops must be an irresistible lure from any steady work. The reporter, however, didn't know Mary well, as it was here in this room surrounded by treetops that most days Mary focused on her paintings. The reporter failed to note the obvious. The house had almost surely been designed to give artists workspace away from areas where children might play, only there were not yet any children in the house. The last large change for the Blairs in 1939 concerned Lee. Though he wasn't painting much during these months, he returned to Chenard to teach evening classes. He didn't teach animation, color theory, or story development, though these were the focus of his professional work at Disney. Instead, he taught landscape painting, as his internal identity was still far more tied to the artist who had once won the Olympic gold medal than it was to being a story artist and color stylist for a large animation studio. In this, Lee now rose up to become a version of Millard Sheets, teaching young artists how to arrange their work. By expressing his ideas to a class, he more firmly tied himself to the values of the California scene movement, even though that movement was now beginning to fade. In finding words to express his views on watercolors and landscape painting, he also defined his future as a fine arts painter. I painted a couple little things, an abstraction of a neighborhood over in the Silver Lake district, he said. But for the most part, his identity was now tied to a type of regional realism. He had been trained to use watercolors in one particular style, one that had been a noticeable trend in the late 1920s and early 1930s, a form that initially brought him acclaim in both Los Angeles and New York. Now, by teaching these principles, he solidified his artistic identity for an audience of his students and also for himself. This was one of the key creative differences between Lee and Mary. Perhaps because her family had been less tied to or even aware of the distinctions between fine and popular art, Mary was more open to experimentation, even if those experiments moved her work in small steps away from established aesthetic trends. She also didn't need public or critical acclaim to confirm her success as an artist, in the same way that Lee needed it to feel he was finding success that might match that of his Blair ancestors. Mary's family mostly thought of her happiness and likely never considered how her watercolors would or would not solidify her role in the larger American art scene. Because of this freedom, essentially not needing to prove she was a critical success to her family, she felt freer to experiment with her own paintings. In this, she saw art more as a type of play than as a means to define her cultural identity. Occasionally, she was open to new impulses, even impulses that came from popular sources, such as an animation studio, whereas Lee saw his commercial work at the studio as entirely separate from the serious art he produced at home. At the end of 1939, as Disney finished Pinocchio and while it continued with Fantasia and Bambi, artists and technicians moved group by group into the new Burbank studio, a large complex situated on 50 acres of land, laid out like a college campus. Here, Walt had created a facility not only to further animation, but also to meet the needs of those who worked there. Though the complex was, as part of its mission, essentially an artistic studio arranged to create animated features, Walt had worked to limit the appearance of an industrial operation and instead sought to give it the feel of an arts community, not unlike that of various art schools. Walt used a varied color scheme to give individual wings in various buildings their own identity. Likewise, he used bricks of different tones to form walls. Each window had its own awning as well as louvered blinds. He hired a studio barber and created a low-cost commissary with high-quality hot meals. Around the studio were green areas, recently planted oak trees, and a few benches, ideal for anyone wishing to take a walk or who just needed a break. In this, Walt developed a workplace so comfortable that his artists hopefully would find a strong sense of enjoyment in simply being there, which would create a stronger connection to the studio and its films. Among the first to move into the new facility were those working on Bambi, who had been housed at the rented harmonizing studio in the center of Hollywood. Another early group were camera operators, who needed rooms with additional height to better manage tall, multiplane cameras arranged on a crane. As groups of Disney employees arrived, most initially loved the new facility. Story and layout artists such as Lee, who had been working in apartment buildings, now found they had their own wings in the new animation building. Full animators each had their own office, while assistant animators tended to share an office, which was a vast improvement over the Hyperion Avenue facilities, where many artists, regardless of their roles, were squeezed into a single room. In-betweeners still needed to work as a group, though their rooms now were far better laid out than earlier rooms. All artists received new desks, created to support the role they filled at the studio. Beyond work areas, the new studio had a gym and lounge area with a membership fee for lead animators, which was situated on the roof of the animation building. Those who worked in ink and paint had access to the tea room, which was used for luncheons, holiday celebrations, and various parties. The new $2 million studio signaled that Disney was now, without challenger, at the top of the animation pecking order, with the new campus arranged to support feature production. Up until this point, it would have been possible to see a handful of other animation studios, particularly Fleischer and those attached to Warner Brothers and MGM, as possible rivals. The new complex, fully open at the start of 1940, indicated that Disney was now positioned to move beyond what other animation studios had achieved in the 1930s. Fantasia indicated that Disney was also interested in exploring how animated film might incorporate elements of high art, such as classical music and visual modes of modernism. In this plan, though, were two hidden problems. First, as Disney artists moved into the new studio, war expanded across Europe, closing key markets for American films. Disney features were projects that required a financial margin, covering cost and producing a profit. To simplify the equation for a well-reviewed American feature, box office revenue from the US and perhaps the UK might cover production costs, with box office revenue from continental Europe and other overseas territories creating the profit. The markets that were closing to American films were, in many cases, the difference between a feature producing a profit or ending with a loss. Second, the new studio, in seeking to streamline work by grouping similar artists together, made clear what had been invisible at Hyperion, specifically which employees were at the top of the salary scale and which were at the bottom. It would take a while for artists to fully see the class system, now transparent, arranged into the new studio layout. But even as artists moved into the 50-acre Burbank complex, some observed that the social arrangements were changing. Most simply felt a vague shift in community. The atmosphere was different, one explained. But a few longtime animators, such as Ward Kimball, quickly diagnosed the underlying issue. Back on Hyperion, Kimball explained, there were 2 animators to a room and 2 assistants. That's 4 guys in a little narrow room. We got to Burbank, we had carpets. The animators got carpet, and the assistants got hard linoleum. For most rank-and-file Disney employees, these differences pertaining to role and class hierarchies would remain hidden for months as they enjoyed the lovely new grounds, full-service dining areas, and the pleasure that came from working with equipment that had been especially designed to support the work they did. By the start of 1940, Mary was growing increasingly discontent with her job at MGM. Though she never specifically pointed to this, part of the problem may have been that now, with the new Disney studio across town, artists at MGM quickly became aware of their second-tier standing. But the primary reason, according to Lee, was that she was quickly growing tired of male chauvinism that was allowed to exist at MGM. Well, she would come home all upset, Lee said, because writer and director Joe Barbera was making passes at her. Initially, Mary didn't want to be employed by any other studio. In terms of finding a permanent home in animation, she said, 3 years in the business with Ising still didn't convince me. But Lee suggested that she considered Disney not only was the artistic level of animation higher there, the studio had a stronger sense of community. Then, with the necessary push from husband Lee, Mary explained, I reluctantly moved to sketch for Disney. She joined Disney on April 11, 1940, a little over 2 months after the last group of artists had moved into the new facility. She was paid $60 a week, more than most assistant animators and more than double the average weekly wage of an American worker. At Disney, she found women in significant roles, specifically working as concept and story artists. The studio nurse, Hazel George, recalled Mary's early months at the studio. Mary was a very warm person, she said. She and her husband were really a team. They were really fond of each other. At Disney, Mary became a concept artist. That is, someone who fleshes out the visual elements of a story, often before the material is sent to story artists to develop narrative sequences. She was initially given work on Dumbo and an early version of Lady and the Tramp. She found that other artists were interested in her personal art, as there was a sense of community there stronger than at other studios where she had worked. One night in May, about a month after she was hired, animator Ward Kimball went to see some of her work on exhibition. We went up to look at sketches, he said in his diary. Nice stuff, Mary Blair painting like her husband. And this was how most animators saw her, as someone who was deeply connected to the regional arts movement, just like Lee, though by this point, Mary was beginning to break away from that movement in small ways. One of her early assignments was to develop a musical sequence around the idea of a baby ballet, intended for a sequel of sorts to Fantasia. In 1940, as Fantasia was nearing completion, Walt believed that the studio might release an updated version of the film in a few years, with 2 or 3 new sequences taking the place of a few existing ones. Mary was given the task of creating artwork around a fanciful dance featuring newborns while they were being cared for by storks. While the storks gathered a dozen or so babies to diaper, feed, and bathe, the babies themselves gracefully stumbled through dance steps. Some performed pirouettes like ballerinas, others arranged themselves into a chorus line. A pair performed ballroom moves, still others performed traditional Russian kick steps. She developed this with two female concept artists already at the studio, Sylvia Holland and Ethel Kulser. As Lee explained, Mary did beautiful color sketches, and it was all these little babies dancing in Disney style to this music. In many places, the babies with their large, peaceful faces were set against taupe backgrounds, with their bodies arranged into identifiable dance poses, almost like art used in advertising, in which a foreground image easily rises up from a neutral background. This, too, was a new feature in her work. In Lee's memory, the overall story for the baby ballet concerned storks trying to get babies dressed in new diapers. A chase sequence, a spooky sequence, Lee said, and then a safety pin. To develop this sequence, the studio asked Mary to imagine the world of babies, how they might experience newborn life while mimicking adult forms of dance. This appears to have been a subject around which Mary was able to lower herself down into the world of idealized infants. If Mary was not yet able to have children of her own in pencils, pastels, and watercolors, she was able to imagine, with a deep sense of generosity, how to present the world of infants under ideal conditions. Babies looking up at the world, eyes closed, with pure contentment mapped across their faces. Babies scootering on wooden carts painted like animals. Babies looking off at an imaginary horizon filled with the alluring images of baby bottles. Another project on which she worked was Penelope and the 12 Months, a story about a young girl who time travels by stepping into an old grandfather clock. In the course of her travels, Penelope encounters elements that define the 4 seasons, such as skiing down a winter slope and riding a donkey cart through a village in spring. Penelope also meets individuals tied to specific holidays, such as a leprechaun. In this, again, Mary was asked to focus on young children, though this time a girl who was around 4 or 5 years old. Story beats for Penelope would change as it developed, at one time even becoming the story of a young Russian girl. But the visual image for this girl would remain roughly the same. She was poised, slender, with a face arranged to express thoughtfulness and contentment. As opposed to the infants of the baby ballet, Penelope possessed self-knowledge, but looked out at the world with a visible sense of hope, an expectation that life would hold a series of pleasant and satisfying experiences. Her head was slightly and only slightly too large for her body, but the design gave the figure a greater range of expression that was mostly drawn toward wonder and quiet delight. This would be the start of what might be called a Mary Blair child, a figure that would shadow Mary into future projects, as though it was a projection of what she most wanted in life, a child old enough to know themselves, yet still young enough to believe that the world would always give them small experiences touched with joy. The child figure here was still raw, not yet fully formed, a girl expressed in flat drawings with wide eyes and a slender mouth. But this would be one of the hinges that connected the two artistic worlds of Mary Blair. She would eventually let elements invented for animation follow her into her personal art. She would also let skills she had developed for her personal art follow her into the studio. Though there were clear divisions in Lee's mind between high and low art, for Mary it seems art was just art, and in it she looked for images that appealed to her and that at times connected to something she believed important or was missing in her own life. Beyond subtle shifts in their art, during these months there was another difference that was becoming more pronounced between Lee and Mary. At Disney, Mary moved herself more quickly into social circles in a few months than Lee had done in 2 years. Some events were either attended or supported by both Lee and Mary together, such as a Disney art sale to benefit the Red Cross in July and a Thanksgiving party at the Pickwick Stables with horseback rides and a barbecue. But for other social events, such as a Halloween costume party and a watercolor show at the studio, featuring the work of 27 Disney artists, Mary simply attended or participated on her own. One of the main attractions of studio life for Mary were the social connections and friendships, particularly with other women. Not long after entering the studio, she developed close friendships with artist Sylvia Holland, the studio nurse Hazel George, and Retta Scott, the first woman at the studio to receive screen credit as a lead animator, overseeing a sequence in which hunting dogs chase and attack Bambi. All 3 of these women had positive opinions of Walt. Later, Retta Scott would say, "Walt was so great. He hired me as his first girl animator. He would just let someone come and experiment, and I just did it." In a 1941 letter, Sylvia Holland said, "Walt certainly likes my stuff and has taken a lot of trouble to show it." That is, Mary found herself in a group of women who had developed ways to get along with Walt and also to have their work supported by him. Like Hazel, Retta, and Sylvia, Mary also warmed to Walt, but she also understood his moods. If Walt was displeased, Mary said, he'd just raise one eyebrow, and you knew it was back to the drawing board. But in this, though she was still a new employee, she was beginning to find a closeness with Walt that exceeded anything Lee had experienced while at the studio. During the middle months of 1940, Lee remained focused on Fantasia. Previously, he had contributed to the Dance of the Hours and the Pastoral Symphony sequences, and now he worked more or less as a live-action art director for the opening sequence, Toccata and Fugue, which would be filmed on the studio's new soundstage. Months earlier, Walt's plan had been to hire a German director schooled in Expressionism to create a colorful montage that combined live-action shots of the orchestra, walls of colored light, and deeply cast shadows as a way of defining the serious and artistic mood of the picture. The conceit for this section initially had come from the title sequence for the two-reel Sorcerer's Apprentice cartoon, which had never been released and instead had been folded into Fantasia. As Sorcerer's Apprentice was no longer a standalone cartoon, it no longer needed its title sequence. That title had been beautifully done, Lee explained, with the abstract forms of the musicians with the conductor down in the foreground. The presentation was largely one of silhouettes against sheets of color. It was just a title setup, but it had been done with colored gelatins and lights. This idea was so nice that they figured, why don't we take that idea and make the Toccata and Fugue right at the start of this whole thing, and not only make the title, but make the opening piece with shadows. This project was originally overseen by Oskar Fischinger, who had previously incorporated abstract images into film. And Oskar Fischinger was trying to do something with the soundtrack, Lee explained, and it looked like a bunch of spinach winding itself all around. In short, though Walt was open to touches of abstraction in the film, Fishinger's ideas were too avant-garde. The dispute over how to arrange this sequence ended with Fishinger quitting without screen credit, which left an opening for a sequence director. By this point, Lee had visually planned out other sequences. For him, taking on Fishinger's role was a slight promotion. Under Lee's direction, the sequence would still have some abstraction, but lean more toward traditional representation. Lee envisioned a sequence in which the orchestra appears for many minutes on screen with colored lights keyed to the underlying symphonic tones. That was the idea, Lee said. We'd take the color spectrum and represent these various tones and instruments within the orchestra in some way. Bright colors such as yellow were paired with the violins. Darker colors were paired with the brass. In this, Lee arranged an opening sequence in which there was pure color, embracing one element of abstraction, but combined with easily recognizable outlines of professional musicians, offering a type of traditional representation. To plan out this sequence, Lee and others made storyboards, then, once those were approved, miniature models of the orchestra, along with a miniature stage onto which lights and shadows could be projected. I made a complete presentation of Bach's toccata and fugue with these little figures, Lee said. From there he made a Leica reel, which was a still picture presentation of how this sequence would look moment by moment when set to music. With the exception of movement, the Leica reel presented the entire sequence much like a series of colorful slides. It, too, was refined until Walt signed off on it. But now, with the war building in Europe, Walt was wary of any change that required additional funds, such as to hire local musicians to play along with a soundtrack previously recorded in Philadelphia. Things were in hysterics around the place, Lee said, because the war was going like crazy in Europe, and they didn't have a lot of money, and they could see the handwriting on the wall. So it was a desperate gamble, bringing in a whole live-action crew for this one sequence. It was shot in sections, first the strings, then the brass, then other instruments such as drums and percussion, with musicians sitting before a large white cyclorama onto which technicians projected colored light. Colored spots were also used, projected, for example, onto the brass curves of a French horn to single out individual instruments during key musical moments. It was done with a little plan from the lights and the little figures upstairs in the studio, Lee said, and then we just took that little plan and executed it large. Of course, Walt was going crazy, because the money was going down the drain real fast with a huge crew. With this, the Disney studio was creating a feature that would challenge how the public viewed animation. 6 years earlier, both Lee and Mary had worked at the iWorks studio, where they had helped create short cartoons filled with slapstick humor and comedic dance numbers. Now they were working on material that would present commercial animation in dialogue with both orchestral music and trends in high art. Without doubt, Mary was more open to how elements from animation, particularly deeply considered and thoughtful animation, might be incorporated into her personal art, while Lee mentally divided these two worlds. To earn a living, Lee worked at the Disney studio, then taught night classes at Chenard, just as Millard Sheets had done before him. When he had time, he still entered his watercolors into competition. In June of 1940, just as he was finalizing designs for the toccata and fugue sequence, he saw his watercolor Gray Station win a medal from the American Watercolor Society in New York. Even though their social lives and their ideas about art were beginning to diverge in small ways, Lee and Mary both saw some success with their personal art and at the studio, as Fantasia finished production. Other problems, however, were waiting for them in the months ahead. I'll be back next week with a new episode. Lastly, as you know, we're an ad-free, listener-supported podcast. We do just two things: deep dives on stories related to the history of the Disney studio and the parks, and news and analysis of current events as they relate to the Disney company. We are funded entirely by listener contributions, specifically by listeners who join us over on Bandcamp as monthly subscribers. On Bandcamp, you will find over 300 episodes not available on iTunes or anywhere else. But the best reason to join us there is to support the work we do here and to make sure that this podcast continues to exist. You can support us by becoming a monthly subscriber at dhipodcast.bandcamp.com. I'll also leave a link down in our show notes. So, until next Sunday, this is Todd James Pierce.